to now bring in Dr. Krishna Udayakumar. He's the founding director of the Duke Global Health Innovation Center and also an associate professor of medicine at Duke University. He joins us now from Raleigh in North Carolina. Doctor, we've been told these rebound infections are quite rare, but Dr. Anthony Fauci had a rebound infection after Paxlovid, now President Biden. Just how common is it?
Yeah, it's an important phenomenon, but one that we don't have great data on yet. If you look at the clinical trials, it seemed to be about 1% to 2% of people that ended up having what we call viral rebound, but that was seen in both the treatment with Paxlovid as well as in the placebo arm. What we know from the best data we have in the real world is that it's probably between 5% and 10% of people that are treated with Paxlovid who then end up being positive again, but we don't know nearly enough about what that really means.
Well, 5 to 10% is still a huge number. So the big question then is, are you contagious during a rebound? Presumably, if you have enough viral load to test positive, you have enough viral load to spread it.
That's right. And we have seen cases being reported of people passing on the virus to others during this period of rebound. And according to CDC guidance, the best way to proceed would really be to isolate again for a minimum of 5 days and to continue to mask through 10 days after that rebound infection.
Well, I see the president is in isolation, but presumably there are also lots of people who don't know they have a rebound infection. And if they're contagious, could the broad use of Paxlovid then actually cause more spread?
I think in the overall scheme, the Paxlovid is very good and is likely to reduce severe infections, hospitalizations, and death, as we've seen in the clinical trials. But we do need to be sure that people aren't ending isolation too early and also are continuing to follow up and masking even after they finish their isolation. So it is important to make sure that people are taking measures after treatment to try to avoid infecting others potentially along the way.
I'm curious about how this is happening because Paxlovid is an antiviral. So is this because it can decrease viral load enough for people to test negative on an antigen test, even though they're still actually sick?
Yeah, we don't quite know enough about this. It could be dependent on how quickly somebody starts it in terms of whether the body's had enough of a chance to mount its own immune response. It could be the duration of therapy of whether 5 days is enough or not. Or it could be other factors we don't quite know yet. So we need to really continue to do the research, even though this is a drug that we have enough information on to start using it in practice.
Well, as you alluded to, there is an argument going at the moment for a longer regimen of Paxlovid. How do you feel about that?
I'd say we don't really have enough data. What we do know is that in almost all cases of rebound infection, the symptoms tend to be mild, and we have not seen bad outcomes from those rebound disease or infections. So there's no data right now that the duration of therapy should be extended or that people should be taking a second course of this medicine Paxlovid if they do have rebound. Again, these are really important questions that need to be tested in the real world now going forward.
So people should just continue to be careful, even if they're testing negative. Dr. Krishna Udayakumar there from Duke University, thanks so much for sharing your expertise with us on Al Jazeera.
Thank you.
Now, police in Guatemala say 41 tourists were shot at while they were climbing a volcano. 10 people are still missing. Some of the hikers had reportedly gone off course. It's not clear, though, who fired at them. The Red Cross is treating the injured. Now, Cuba has announced electricity cuts in the capital, Havana, beginning on Monday. The city will have scheduled blackouts, and the annual carnival has also been cancelled. It's in response to an ongoing energy crisis. Havana is home to more than 11 million people and had been spared from the island's daily 4-hour power cuts. Well, the number of women murdered or missing in northern Mexico has risen by almost 40% in the past 5 years. The situation has pushed one woman in the city of Monterrey to launch an exclusively female taxi service. Here's her story.
My name is Dulce Maria Campos Gonzalez, founder of Girls Taxi Monterrey, a family-owned enterprise. We offer transport services for girls and women and guarantee they get to their destinations safely. On our first weekend, we started trending and we were shared more than 42,000 times. That made me very happy, but at the same time, it got us thinking. Why such a reaction? It means that there's a vacuum in our community, that women are scared. That's what made us start this service, the fear of how unprotected we women of any age are in our community. We have more than 3,000 clients on WhatsApp. Our other social network accounts are also full. We can't handle any more requests. Many girls tell us why they chose us. Some were harassed, mistreated, even sexually abused by a driver. They are terrified of using any service with male drivers. We think that whatever a girl is doing on the street, she shouldn't feel threatened or in danger. The business is called Girls Taxi, but it will always remind me of Dulce Celeste, my daughter. I founded it for her. I want a female-driven cab in every corner of the world so she can feel safe.
An Italian man has been arrested on suspicion of murdering a Nigerian vendor in a killing that's caused outrage and protests in Italy. Video shows an assailant wrestling Alika Ogochukwu onto his back and beating him. Bystanders in the town on Italy's Adriatic coast called police but didn't intervene. The victim's wife and members of the Nigerian community held a demonstration demanding justice. Well, the growing number of migrants and refugees arriving in Italy is being politicized ahead of September's snap election. Prime Minister Mario Draghi resigned earlier this month when his coalition government fell apart. Natasha Ghaname reports on how the issue is influencing voters on the island of Lampedusa, which has seen a recent surge in arrivals.
The aquamarine waters of the Mediterranean, surrounded by craggy cliffs, keep luring tourists to these coves. However, vacationers aren't the reason this small Italian island has made headlines in recent years. In 2013, 368 migrants and refugees died when an overcrowded boat capsized near Lampedusa. It was one of the worst shipwrecks in modern European history. Francesco Barada's father was fishing with a friend when he heard cries for help. He rescued a dozen people and became a national hero.
The people who think all migrants are criminals don't understand what it means to suffer for something and forget that the Westerners have exploited the same Africa they came from.
After people protested, the days when asylum seekers arrived and roamed the narrow streets are long gone. Now their presence is invisible to most.
There is a problem. When the sea is very calm like today, we see at least 1,500 people arriving each week. They are immediately transferred to Sicily or somewhere else. We don't see them on the island.
Yet the Migrant Welcome Center is overflowing. The uptick in arrivals coincides with the collapse of Prime Minister Mario Draghi's coalition government. This month, he announced his resignation twice. Far-right and populist parties torpedo Draghi's government and are expected to prevail in snap elections on September 25th. The Maggiore siblings come from one of the oldest families on Lampedusa. They make a living selling produce out of a truck in the city center.
We should vote for the far right and give them an opportunity to run the country before we say they are not good. Currently, migrants are coming here every day without any rules.
Barada hopes Italians won't allow far-right and populist candidates to scapegoat migrants. Almost a decade later, his father has remained in contact with some of the people he rescued, and he says the sadness in their eyes remains. Natasha Ghaname, Al Jazeera, Lampedusa, Italy.
Now, China's space agency has been accused of not following international protocol over space debris for a third time. Have a look at this video. It was taken in the Malaysian city of Kuching, which is said to show remnants of the Long March 5B rocket falling uncontrollably back to Earth. China says most of the rocket burned up during re-entry over the sea between the island of Borneo and the Philippines. But in a statement, NASA says China did not share specific trajectory information as their Long March 5B rocket fell back to Earth. It went on to say that all spacefaring nations should follow established best practices and do their part to share this type of information. Doing so is critical to the responsible use of space and to ensure the safety of people here on Earth. Well, the issue of space junk is a growing problem. Most rockets and satellites burn up during re-entry into the Earth's orbit, but some debris does reach Earth's surface intact. Now, according to the European Space Agency, there are 2,000 active satellites in Earth's orbit. Another 3,000 are circling offline. Scientists say without satellite launch regulations, 1 out of every 15 visible lights in the night sky will be a satellite and not a star. Well, earlier I spoke to Donald Kessler. He's a former senior scientist for orbital debris research at NASA. And he says satellite and rocket launches can sometimes be more about making money than research.
We do have agreements that we have all agreed upon. I know we work very quickly with all the European agencies and Russia, and China was included in those discussions as well as to what would be a responsible thing to do. Well, everything seems to have taken on a different task. When the space program originally began, it was for research. It's become a way of making money. It's an enterprise, and that can go very badly. There's a thing called the tragedy of the commons, which says that anytime you move into a common area where everybody has equal rights, but there's no regulation, they will destroy that environment. Well, space is an environment, a shared environment. And without regulations and without adhering to those regulations, the whole thing will come apart.
Now, a lucky ticket holder in the US has beaten the odds to win Friday's $1.3 billion Mega Millions jackpot. It's the United States' third largest lottery prize ever. The ticket was bought in a suburb of Chicago, but the winner is still yet to come forward. On Sunday, the England women's football team faces Germany in the Euro 2022 final. 90,000 fans are expected to pack London's Wembley Stadium, and that would be the biggest crowd for any Euros final, men's or women's. Nadeem Barber takes a look at what the tournament means for the growth of the women's game in England.
Across England, there's something in the air.
Honestly, never felt better. Got my best mate with me, right? And it's absolutely mint.
This was Sheffield after England's women, known as the Lionesses, thrashed Sweden to reach Sunday's Euro 2022 final. Nationwide screenings like this are bringing people together in public, and nearly 500,000 fans have attended matches so far, more than doubling the figure for the last tournament 5 years ago.
Ladies football is just a completely different atmosphere to the men's. It's more, I don't know, it's family, it's more fun, everyone joining in, singing Mexican waves.
And underpinning the Euros, there's a whole ecosystem, from the Women's Super League to semi-professional clubs like Dulwich Hamlet here in South London to school teams. Hard to believe that for decades women were barred from competing in a game that the English Football Association called quite unsuitable for females.
At grounds up and down the country, women's teams offer the fans quality football week in, week out. But there's no doubt the Euros tournament has opened many more people's eyes. And for clubs like this, that can only be a good thing.
I've got mates texting me who have had no interest in women's football before, getting really excited about this tournament. Lots of guys as well, which is nice to see, people of all ages. I was on my bicycle the other day cycling home, and I was stopped at traffic lights, and there was 3 old men, and I could hear them talking about the England game that was on the night before. And just things like that, that for me is really special.
In recent years, women's and girls' football has really taken off. By 2020, the number taking part in England had reached almost 3.5 million. But there's still a long way to go before the women earn anywhere near as much as the men do, or make a living from the sport outside the top tier.
Hopefully, like with the Euros, it's going to bring a little bit more attention to the game, and the women will start getting a bit more recognition because they do train really hard. It would be nice for them to be more accepted as the sports people that they actually are.
As the national team gear up for their biggest match ever, they'll be hoping the home crowd can give them the edge over Germany. But it's not just about the result.
We hope that we got everyone so enthusiastic, and that at the end, actually, the whole country is proud of us, and that even more girls and boys will start playing football.
Of course, for the Lionesses, going one step further than England's men did last year and lifting the trophy is the ultimate goal.
England!
Nadeem Barber, Al Jazeera, London.
Hello there, this is Al Jazeera, and these are the headlines. Supporters of Shia cleric Muqtada al-Sadr remain camped inside Iraq's parliament after storming the building for a second time this week. They're protesting against the nomination of Mohammad Shia al-Sudani as prime minister. Ukraine's president has ordered the evacuation of the eastern Donetsk region as fighting with Russian forces intensifies. Volodymyr Zelensky also said people in the wider Donbass region, which includes neighboring Luhansk, need to leave.
It is important for all our people who still remain in the Donbass in the areas of the fiercest fighting. There are hundreds of thousands of people, tens of thousands of children. Many refuse to leave, but it really needs to be done. This decision will have to be taken regardless, believe me. And the sooner it's made, the more people who leave the Donetsk region now, the fewer people the Russian army will have time to kill.
Earlier, Zelensky called on the UN and the International Committee of the Red Cross to take action over an attack on a prison complex in Olenivka, in which dozens of Ukrainian prisoners of war were killed. Russia and Ukraine have accused each other of carrying out that attack, and the Kremlin has also invited the UN and Red Cross to investigate. New York State and San Francisco have declared states of emergency due to the rising number of monkeypox infections. New York now accounts for 1 in 4 infections in the U.S., with 1,300 reported. U.S. President Joe Biden is back in isolation after testing positive again for COVID-19. The White House says it's a so-called rebound infection, which can occur after treatment with the antiviral drug Paxlovid. Biden first tested positive for the virus on July 21st. He's said to be free of symptoms and feeling well. Iran's president has visited areas hit by flooding and landslides, which have killed at least 80 people. Heavy rains have caused havoc in dozens of provinces over the past week. NASA has accused China's space agency of not following international protocol over space debris for a third time. The U.S. Space Agency says Beijing did not share specific trajectory information as its Long March 5B rocket fell uncontrollably back to Earth. President has visited areas. Well, those are the headlines. Next, it's the Listening Post. Killed at least 80 people. Heavy rains.
On counting the cost, the European Central Bank raises interest rates to rein in inflation. Could rising borrowing costs and political turmoil worsen Italy's debt burden? And the EU agrees to cut natural gas use in winter. Will that help to avert an energy crisis? Counting the cost on Al Jazeera.
Julian Assange is still in the legal fight of his life, and there are geopolitical angles aplenty in this story. Blacklisting journalists it doesn't like. The Zelensky government's censorship can be Kremlin-esque. And with misinformation and propaganda swirling across social media, Kenya gets ready to vote. Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post, where we don't cover the news, we cover the way the news is covered. We start with the journalist currently locked in a maximum security prison in London without having been tried for any crime. Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, is currently in legal purgatory. Last month, the UK government formally approved his extradition to the US, where he is wanted for publishing classified documents that exposed, among other things, American war crimes. The UK's High Court now decides whether to allow Assange to appeal against an extradition that press freedom groups say would put journalists everywhere at risk. The American pursuit of Assange is far more than a question of law. It's about geopolitics. U.S. allies like Sweden, the UK, and Australia have all assisted Washington on this.
Challenges.
Support for
helps
Assange
businesses
has
like
been
yours
growing. And Australia, his birthplace, now has a prime minister
back in the
who, while in
driver's seat
opposition,
and take
wanted him
control of your
released.
supply chain.
Has Anthony
Get a
Albanese
demo
changed
and see
his
what
tune?
Shippable
And if he
can
hasn't,
do.
will it make a difference? Our starting point this week is WikiLeaks, the work Assange's news organization did that landed him in jail. It's easy to get buried in the legalities of the case against Julian Assange. The jurisdictional questions, the extradition warrants, the accusations of illegal hacking and espionage. What can get lost is the journalism Assange and WikiLeaks produced starting in the mid-2000s that news outlets around the world went to town on, including what we learned about American wars in Afghanistan and then Iraq.
What they couldn't tolerate was when Julian Assange was sent video footage.
Light them all up. Come on, fire!
Which showed an Apache helicopter in Baghdad killing civilians. Ordinary people. That is the principal reason, the exposure of war crimes that caused outrage, especially in the intelligence agencies of the United States.
And then in 2010, there was a huge cache of United States diplomatic cables. There were some quite frank assessments of foreign leaders.
With WikiLeaks revealing a directive from Clinton for US diplomats at the United Nations to spy on their counterparts.
That perhaps were not considered in the best traditions of diplomacy, shall we say.
And those cables also, to some extent, helped spark the Arab Spring, starting with Tunisia, when the diplomatic cable showed that ruling family was, corrupt and triggered the protests that led to that government's downfall. So Assange and WikiLeaks have had a tremendous impact on the world, especially in those early years.
The irregularities and flaws in the legal case, the video evidence the U.S. acquired illegally when Assange was at the Ecuadorian embassy in London, a key witness for the prosecution, a hacker who turned out to be a convicted pedophile who later admitted his testimony was made up, the assurances the Americans have made and the British have accepted that Assange will get a fair trial when the U.S. has not even denied reports that its officials discussed assassinating him in 2017. None of that has really changed. What has changed is that Australia has a new Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese. The question for Assange, who was born in Australia, is which Anthony Albanese are we talking about? The opposition leader who said this during the election campaign about Assange and his most famous source, Chelsea Manning.
That enough is enough. The person who has actually leaked the classified information to WikiLeaks is free, but the person who published that information remains in jail.
Or Prime Minister Albanese, who, when asked if his government will press the U.S. to drop the charges, now says diplomacy is best conducted in private, discreetly.
Can we imagine if Iran or North Korea imprisoned an Australian? Would the Australian Prime Minister be content with just talking behind the scenes and quietly lobbying, or would he make more of a public pressure campaign? And we have to remember that the US is an ally that depends on Australia for some of its strategic goals in the Pacific. It's an ally that Australia has done favors for, but perhaps Albanese is not willing to spend the political capital he has on helping Assange.
The reason that no Australian government has dared challenge the extradition of Assange is that they are now locked in with the United States, just like Britain on every level, on defense and ideology. What makes them different from Britain is that their main economic deals are with China, but they are ideologically and via a big uniting factor, unfortunately, is race. This is largely still a white country, a white dependency, if you like. And for that reason, they will not break with the United States.
Compare Australia and its government's public reticence on the Julian Assange case to another American ally, Mexico, whose president says if Assange is extradited to the U.S., where he could die in custody, America may as well dismantle the Statue of Liberty.
Estoy a favor de que se le indulte.
There's Brazil, where opposition leader and current favorite to return to the president's office, Lula da Silva.
O Assange cometeu
É o crime que todos vocês que falaram cometeram. Falar a verdade.
The WikiLeaks founder has far more political support in Latin America than in countries to the north. Germany, for example, where they've built statues of Assange and where a Stuttgart NGO awarded him a Peace Prize in 2020. More than 70 members of parliament have demanded his release, but the government, led by Chancellor Olaf Scholz, is content to leave the matter to his allies in the US and the UK.
So I asked the German Chancellor's office for their position on the Julian Assange case, and they replied with a statement, and I'm going to quote, "The federal government has full confidence in the rule of law of the British judiciary and therefore refrains from making any further statements on the ongoing proceedings."
The German government could act. They're too scared to do it because they're part and parcel of this whole NATO-EU complex, and in Germany there is more support for him. Why? Because Germans have been taught that things like arresting journalists or extraditing them to a likely death are things that used to happen either under Hitler or under the East German government. We don't behave like that.
The US is our most important ally apart from the European Union and the UK. And we are at the moment in a situation where we are in a war with Russia. So we need to be pragmatic, or at least our government thinks it needs to be pragmatic.
I think this statue is a great reminder.
All the support for the case of Julian Assange and the fight against the extradition is very important and heartening. I don't think it will change the case, which is very sad because we are sacrificing our values.
That's what we're seeing in America, the UK, Germany, and from so many other governments. In Canada, France, Italy, just to name a few. Values sacrificed, alliances preserved, and precedents, dangerous ones for journalism, about to be set.
It's very broadly agreed amongst lawyers and researchers, as well as journalists and civil liberties campaigners, that this would set a terrible precedent. What he did is, as many journalists have pointed out, no different to what journalists and publishers do every day. So it is basically criminalizing journalism.
There is a very real danger that this sets not just a precedent for the US to be able to wield this very extreme power of being able to pluck a journalist out from any country and send them to jail in their own borders. But also that other countries now looking at this example will say, well, hold on, if the United States can do this, why can't we? China is a rising power. Imagine now if China is able to say, well, we're going to do the same thing because we don't like what some of these American or British or Australian journalists are publishing about what's going on in our country. So it's something that US officials would do well to contemplate.
Political propaganda can be clumsy, and Russian tactics in Ukraine are well documented. But two can play at that game, and Johanna Hoos is here with the details.
We have to go back to March 2021, roughly a year before the war started. President Volodymyr Zelensky established the Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation to curb what he described as propaganda and destructive information from Moscow. Through these months of war, the center has been compiling a list of individuals that it deems to be promoting narratives consonant with Russian propaganda. That list includes politicians from around the world, from Rand Paul in the US, to Marine Le Pen and Eric Zemmour in France, to Robert Fico in Slovakia. Their alleged crime? Public statements that appeared to side with the Kremlin. Beyond politicians, there are academics and journalists, military analysts like Edward Luttwak, an American who suggested that the Donetsk and Luhansk regions should hold referendums to determine their futures. Political science scholar John Mersheimer's name is there as well, for arguing that NATO's expansion provoked Russia. American journalist Glenn Greenwald, who was on the list for, quote, scaremongering, called it standard McCarthyite idiocy and defended his right to be critical of a proxy war between the world's two largest nuclear powers. Lutwak tweeted that Kiev's enemy list needs, quote, some serious scrutiny, rejecting his pro-Kremlin label and reiterating the fact that he has personally lobbied for NATO countries to send more weapons to Ukraine. Exactly what Kiev hopes to achieve with this list is unclear. Some of the arguments they've taken issue with, like questioning NATO's expansion, have been made by numerous analysts and reporters, including us here at the Listening Post. By blacklisting people for that sort of thing, they're copying a tactic straight out of Russia's censorship playbook.
Thanks, Joe. Kenya is about to go to the polls with its presidential election on August 9th. Uhuru Kenyatta cannot run again because of term limits, and two familiar figures are vying to succeed him: the Deputy President, William Ruto, and Raila Odinga, an opposition figure taking his fifth run at the top job. Social media is where most Kenyans go to keep track of developments. It's a place where politicians are paying influencers and small armies of bloggers to get the word out, to play the fear card, raise the specter of ethnic tensions and political violence if that's what it takes to get votes. Kenyan politicians used to rely on some questionable Western communications firms to run their social media, produce their propaganda, and spread misinformation. Now they have new sources of media expertise available domestically to do that. The Listening Post's Ryan Coles now on Kenyan influencers for hire and the misinformation running rampant in this election campaign.
It usually begins with a simple "What's up" message. A political operative delivers an assignment to a social media influencer for hire. The jobs vary, but the ask is always the same: make this content go viral. We spoke with a Kenyan influencer who insisted he had to remain anonymous. The person you see here is an actor. During our interview, the influencer revealed some secrets about an industry that, as Kenya gears up for a general election, has grown in size and impact. So tell me about your operation. What's the size of your team? How does the process work?
My team is sometimes just 30 people and can grow up to 100. I am the point of contact with the client, and I let the team know about our assignments through a WhatsApp group chat. We then use Facebook and Twitter to push political messages.
How much do your services cost?
It depends on the task, but it ranges from 50,000 shillings to 1 million shillings. That's like $8,500 US.
Can you give me an example of something your team has made go viral?
I'm not going to answer that, because then you'd know who my client is.
Okay, but in general terms, how would you describe the content you help spread for politicians?
Look, my team is ethical. We are very careful with what we push. We mainly share content that promotes the politician's track record, or if they are new, their promises for the people.
Have you ever agreed, though, to attack your client's competitor or spread negative information?
Yes, it happens.
For all the assertions that the work is above board, this influencer does not advertise his services, and secrecy is paramount.
It's now become part of the repertoire of being a big honcho politician to also have a certain amount of influencers or bloggers or people that can quickly whip up a certain sentiment about you online. It is done in secret because sometimes some of the stuff that these people put out, again, falls into incitement, and a lot of it is fake and manipulated content. And much of the time, they also violate the terms of service of many of the platforms in which they engage.
Propaganda is a budget item when it comes to politics. You have to have budget for propaganda. You have to have budget for amplification. It's usually under communications, but we know what communication means in politics. We know what that means. Like, that's the name of the game is propaganda.
Chances are minimum that Raila Odinga can win 2022 general election.
Influencers are ubiquitous this election and are utilized by virtually all Kenyan politicians. Their primary targets are leading candidates William Ruto, the current deputy president, and Raila Odinga, the former prime minister. Much of the misinformation features run-of-the-mill fakery, Photoshop campaign rallies, fake endorsements, or doctored academic qualifications. However, the posts often veer into darker territory, and a lot of them live on TikTok.
This is an application that did not exist 5 years ago when we were having our elections in 2017. But suddenly TikTok has become very popular with the younger demographics. Much of the content that we had reviewed was teetering on the edge of promoting hate speech and incitement to violence, using othering language, which we know has been used a lot during genocide, things like madoadoa, which is a very laden term in the Kenyan political context.
Ya UDA ni kutoa madoadoa. Madoadoa kama Wakikuyu, Waluya, Wakisii, Waluo, Wasomali na hata Wakamba. Tuko tayari kutoa madoadoa.
The madoadoa just means it's almost like stains or something. And so when you mention that, what you're trying to do is bring up tribal tensions. What you're trying to do is re-traumatize Kenyans. We were thrown deep into the post-election violence, and those wounds are still very fresh. They will continue to do videos that look like, horror, apocalyptic, end of the days.
That recipe for online success may have been imported. Take this video. It paints a devastating future for Kenya if William Ruto wins the election. It's slickly produced, but is a direct ripoff, scene for scene, of a video President Kenyatta's campaign put out in 2017. The target was Raila Odinga, who was campaigning for office back then as well. The video was put together by Harris Media, a Texas-based marketing agency made infamous by its political work around the world. They and other companies like the notorious British consulting firm Cambridge Analytica worked on 2 of Kenyatta's presidential campaigns. Those companies might not be involved with the candidates in the 2022 elections, but the methods they employed are still in play.
Their stench is still pretty much in the room. A lot of the tactics that we saw attributed to Cambridge Analytica and the other 2 companies are still very much being used within our political sphere, especially on social media platforms. I look at something like the Real Raila campaign, which I think we had never really seen before, that was sort of trying to paint this picture of the opposition as this sort of boogeyman that needed to be feared. The use of very emotive campaigning characteristics within campaign messaging, and the very specific use of platforms to try and disseminate this content into the public consciousness.
It's nearly impossible to pinpoint the origins of this content or the number of players involved. And with so few influencers willing to speak on the record, much of this process remains in the shadows. So we took our question straight to the digital strategists of the 2 leading candidates, William Ruto and Raila Odinga. Mr. Otani, thanks for speaking with me. Can you clarify, has the Raila Odinga campaign hired influencers to amplify their message this election?
The majority of the influencers who do things for Odinga are people who are volunteered, who believe in his messaging.
So you're saying you don't hire influencers in secret to attack Mr. Odinga's opponents or spread propaganda about his main rival, William Ruto?
To my knowledge, no. The Kenya Kwanza campaign focuses a lot on switching videos, switching messaging. Like Raila will say one thing, then they will twist it to mean something else. We don't engage in the kind of propaganda that other team engages in.
I spoke with the Odinga campaign, and they say you guys, on the Ruto side, what you call the Kenya Kwanza campaign, edit videos and hire influencers to spread propaganda. Is that true?
We have no time actually in the campaign to do even manipulation. Even me at the top of the campaign, I'm not hired by the campaign. I'm a volunteer to the campaign. So any other thing that would say that the campaign has hired people, then would be misinformation by itself.
Do you know whether the Odinga campaign hires influencers to spread negative messaging about Ruto?
I mean, when you see 40 people sharing exactly the same message, then those are definitely people on a payroll. So if there is money and payment, it's on the other side of the campaign.
Accountability is lacking in Kenya. Some steps have been taken by platforms like TikTok and Twitter to delete harmful information or suspend accounts, but it hasn't been nearly enough to stop the problem. The main governmental agency responsible for doing something is called the NCIC. They released a list of banned words on social media, including madoadoa, but were widely ignored. They've even brought influencers to court for hate speech, but Kenyans have yet to see a prosecution.
The government could be really doing things but we don't get to know what they do because there's always an information gap, that there are active cases on hate speech in court. There are people who have actually been arrested on hate speech, but these cases are usually not highlighted. So the resulting effect is us thinking that the government is not doing anything. And I think what we need and what my ask would be to the government is to make an example out of a case where we actually see it and we actually see them being persecuted.
I think the reason we have poor accountability when it comes to this type of thing is because we have very weak institutions. The NCIC could be one of those entities where we are seeing very clear examples of violation of certain laws, but nothing is essentially happening to the people that break those laws. Yeah, they're not strong, independent institutions that are unshakable to the opinions of their overlords within the government. And that's a problem.
And finally, the Pope has just completed what the Vatican calls a pilgrimage of penance to Canada. Pope Francis started out west with an official and long overdue apology to Indigenous communities for the horrors and violence inflicted by the Catholic Church, particularly at schools run by priests and nuns. Indigenous children suffered physical and sexual abuse, punishment for speaking their mother tongue. Hundreds of them disappeared, buried in graves only recently discovered. The investigations are ongoing. There will be more news to come. Here are some recommendations on where to go online to find it. APTN National News, part of Aboriginal Peoples TV, is a website dedicated to Indigenous history and current events. It hosts podcasts and programs from interviews to investigations. Groundwork for Change is a site any Canadian can use to educate themselves about Aboriginal issues through videos, maps, articles, and links to help people connect with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. Kukuk West is an Indigenous online news magazine focused on stories on First Nations communities in Atlantic Canada. Most of their followers use Twitter. They're also active on Instagram and Facebook. On Twitter, we follow Pam Palmatier, an Indigenous Mi'kmaq lawyer, professor, activist, and politician. Tanya Talaga, author, columnist at the Globe and Mail, and founder of Makwa Creative, an Indigenous-owned production company. And Cindy Blackstock, executive director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada. She's all over this story, one that the Canadian mainstream media have paid too little attention to for far too long. See you next time here at the Listening Post.
Then would be misinformation by itself.
Do you know whether the Odinga campaign hires influencers?
Setting the discussions.
I'd love to see every time there was an attack on a mosque, all the right-wing organizations saying we don't approve of this.
Examining the headlines.
This court is a political court that is making political decisions.
Explore an abundance of world-class programming designed to inform.
The biggest fear of any autocrat is crowds of people on the streets.
Motivate and inspire you.
He's opening an area that a blind person never thought they could do.
On Al Jazeera.
They watch us. They gather evidence. But so can we. An American cyber activist develops an app used in Brazil to monitor the police.
We have more cameras than they do because we're the people.
A bigger brother. Rebel Geeks on Al Jazeera.
No place in Saigon was safe. The press retreated to the caravel.
A media hub and vital vantage point during the first truly televised war.
From the roof, we could see the evacuation at the American embassy,
where the most iconic images of the conflict in Vietnam were transmitted to the world.
This was the front row seat to the final stages of the war.
Saigon Caravel, war hotels on Al Jazeera.
From the world's most populated region, in-depth stories from across Asia and the Pacific, with diverse cultures and conflicting politics. 101 East on Al Jazeera.
Has just completed what the Vatican calls a pilgrimage of penance.
Thousands of followers of influential cleric Muqtada Sadr. Hello, I'm Darren Jordan. This is Al Jazeera, live from Doha. Also coming up, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky orders the evacuation of the Donbass region, where fighting has intensified in recent days.
There will be more news to come.
New York State and San Francisco declare states of emergencies. Hundreds of monkeypox cases have been recorded in both places. And an exclusive female taxi service in one Mexican city as women face a growing threat of violence.
It hosts podcasts and programs.
Protesters remain camped inside Iraq's parliament after storming the building for a second time this week. Police fired tear gas at the crowds in the green zone. More than 125 people have been injured. Supporters of Shia cleric Muqtada Sadr are protesting against the nomination of Mohammed Shaya al-Sadani as Prime Minister. Mahmoud Abdulwahid reports.
Once again, supporters of Shia cleric Muqtada Sadr occupy Iraq's parliament. But this time they vow to stay put until their demands are met.
We reject corruption and corrupt politicians. Sudan is a tool in the hands of foreign powers. He and his colleagues work against Iraq. He wants to do anything.
We won't leave until we kick those corrupt politicians out of Iraq.
A pro-Iranian bloc called the Coordination Framework has nominated Mohammed Shaya al-Sudani for Prime Minister. These protesters have linked him to former Premier Nouri al-Maliki.
Despite calls for calm by many officials, including Sadr, who instructed his supporters to refrain from violence, the protests were far from peaceful.
Crowds of people.
The Health Ministry has confirmed dozens of people, including soldiers, were injured when police fired tear gas at the crowds.
Everyone shares the responsibility, political parties, the political elites, social forces and influential figures. We have to say it to everyone. Everyone must act wisely, with Iraq in mind, in order not to lose again.
We have more cameras than they do because we're the people.
A bigger brother. Rebel Geeks on Al Jazeera.
No place in was safe. The press retreated to the caravel.
A media hub and vital vantage point during the first truly televised war.
From the roof, we could see the evacuation at the American embassy,
where the most iconic images of the conflict in Vietnam were transmitted to the world.
This was the front row seat to the final stages of the war.
Saigon Caravel, war hotels on Al Jazeera.
From the world's most populated region, in-depth stories from across Asia and the Pacific, with diverse cultures and conflicting politics. 101 East on Al Jazeera.
Premiership candidate for the entire coordination framework. And that really pushed Sadr to react and to react strongly. Now he's waiting for this candidate to withdraw from the race. I don't think the framework will hold up for long if this protest continues. I think some people in the framework
from Doha also coming up. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky orders the evacuation of the Donbass region, where fighting has intensified in recent days. New York State and San Francisco declare states of emergencies. Hundreds of monkeypox cases have been recorded in both places. And an exclusive female taxi service in one Mexican city as women face a growing threat of violence. Iran's president has visited areas hit by flooding and landslides which have killed at least 80 people. Ibrahim Raisi travelled with officials of the Iranian Red Crescent in the city of Firuska. Protesters remain camped inside. Heavy rain and flooding have caused havoc in dozens of provinces over the past week. This week, at least 30 people had tear gas in the crowds in the green zone. Ukraine's president has ordered the evacuation of the eastern region of Donetsk, fighting with Russian forces intensified. The nomination in a late-night address, Volodymyr Zelensky said people must leave the wider Donbass region, which includes Luhansk.
Once again, supporters of Shia cleric Muqtada Sadr occupy Iraq's parliament.
Areas of the fiercest fighting. There are hundreds of thousands of people, tens of thousands of children. Many refuse to leave, but it really needs to be done. This decision will have to be taken regardless, believe me. And the sooner it's made, the more people who leave the Donetsk region now, the fewer people the Russian army have time to kill.
Well, earlier, Zelensky called on the UN and the International Committee of the Red Cross to take action over an attack on a prison complex. Dozens of Ukrainian prisoners of war were killed in Olenivka. Russia and Ukraine have accused each other of carrying out the attack. The Kremlin has invited the UN and Red Cross to investigate.
Has nominated
17 ships loaded with Ukrainian grain are ready to depart from Odessa for the first time since Russia invaded in February. More wheat and corn are being harvested as the war continues. The loss of Ukrainian exports has raised global food prices, threatened political instability, and helped push more people into poverty and hunger in vulnerable countries. John Hendren has more from Odessa.
Ukraine and the world are waiting for 17 ships filled with grain to distribute food across the globe and help avert a global hunger crisis. President Volodymyr Zelensky on Friday said those ships would leave soon, but they haven't left yet. There are a number of logistical problems involved with that. Some of those could be insurance, the fact that the waters are mined, and most importantly, security, because those ships will be traveling through an active war zone. We've also been told that the Secretary General, through a spokesman, has offered to send a team of experts to a prison in eastern Ukraine to determine whether it was a Russian strike or a Ukrainian strike that killed 50 people. Those people were prisoners who fought on behalf of Ukraine in Mariupol. One of the things they'll look at is whether that was an external strike, as the Russians claim. They say it was a Ukrainian missile, or whether it was an explosion from inside. That is what the Ukrainians claim. Volodymyr Zelensky says it was a war crime.
Spain has reported its second monkeypox-related death in the past 2 days. They're the first confirmed deaths from the virus in the European Union. Spain's case numbers are Europe's highest at almost 4,300. There have been more than 21,000 cases in nearly 80 countries since May. In the U.S., New York State and the city of San Francisco have declared states of emergency due to rising numbers of the virus. New York accounts for 1 in 4 infections across the U.S., with 1,300 cases reported there. There are 800 cases in California, more than a quarter of which are in San Francisco. Mike Hanna's in Washington with more on the U.S. government's response to the outbreak.
What it means is that, for example, in New York State, the public emergency has been declared. This allows the state to permit paramedics, nurses, for example, to administer doses of the vaccine. It also opens up the door to greater federal assistance. Now, it is interesting in terms of the fact that you have had observers say that it's very difficult to coordinate on the basis of 57 entities. Now, that is the US's 50 states, plus the 7 regions and major cities that are involved. In San Francisco, for example, which is the first city to declare public health emergency, once again, that opens up the avenues of assistance from the state as well as from federal level. So it is a bit of a hodgepodge response in terms of the health department's way of dealing with this. And what I must note as well, very importantly, on Wednesday, the CDC said that there were some 4,500 cases reported. Last night, those figures were updated to some 5.4 thousand. Now, that's an increase of 10% over some 2 days. So clearly, this is a health problem that is not stabilizing. It is, in fact, mounting.
Al-Shabaab fighters have attacked a military base on the Somalia-Ethiopia border. The armed group, which is linked to Al-Qaeda, says it's killed more than 100 Ethiopian troops, but the government says its soldiers killed dozens of fighters who tried to infiltrate the base. Journalist Samuel Getachew has more now from Addis Ababa.
The Somali state government has been supported by the Ethiopian forces trying to fight with Al-Shabaab. There was a story that came out saying that 150 Al-Shabaab, at least, members have been killed. But throughout the week and even earlier this month, there has been different kind of claim and counterclaim of victims and victory and so on, enough for the UN, WFP to start removing some of its employees. The Somali region is one of the areas where it has a camp that's taking care of thousands of Ethiopian displaced people, and this goes to show you that this conflict is really moving forward. Al-Shabaab was claiming that they have been killing or winning the battle so far, but this is the first time that the Ethiopian side or the regional side, the Somali regional government forces, have really claimed this many victims or this many killings in a way to stop Al-Shabaab from advancing to the capital of the Somali region and far beyond.
Pope Francis has hinted he may consider retirement. He says this week's trip to Canada has been challenging due to pain he suffers in his knees. He needed a wheelchair to get around after straining his ligaments earlier this year. As he left Canada, he also described crimes committed in Canada's residential schools as genocide. During the trip, the Pope apologized to Indigenous people abused at the schools, most of which are run by the Catholic Church.
It's true that I did not use the word because I didn't think of it, but I described genocide. I apologized, I asked for forgiveness for this work, which was genocide. I condemn this. Taking children away and trying to change their culture, their minds, change their traditions, race and an entire culture. Yes, genocide is a technical word, but I did not use it because I did not think of it. But you can say that I said it was a genocide.
US President Joe Biden is back in isolation after testing positive again for COVID-19. The White House says it's a rebound infection, which can occur after treatment with the antiviral drug Paxlovid. Biden first tested positive for the virus on July 21st. He left isolation after testing negative this week.
Hey folks, Joe Biden here. Tested positive this morning. Going to be working from home for the next couple of days. And I'm feeling fine. Everything's good. But Commander and I got a lot of work to do.
US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has raised the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh during a call with Israel's defense minister. The State Department says Blinken told Benny Gantz there's a need for accountability for the killing of the veteran Al Jazeera journalist. Blinken met with members of the Abu Akleh family in Washington on Tuesday. Shireen was shot dead by Israeli forces while on assignment in the occupied West Bank in May. Time for a short break here in Al Jazeera. When we come back, China's been accused of ignoring the rules of space again as pieces of its rocket fall back to Earth. And attendance records are tumbling as football fans flock to the Women's Euros in England. The finals on Sunday, and the hosts are in it. More on that. Stay with us.
Over some 2 days.
Now, that flooding in Kentucky has definitely been newsworthy, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's over just because the cloud is drifting away a bit further south. But it is this line of cloud that's been persistent in its nature that's produced these big thunderstorms, the flooding in Las Vegas, the flooding in Kentucky. The picture on Sunday sees more showers developing to the west. Now, this is Kentucky, and the flooding is in the east, so there is a bit of a southerly bias, and we're more into Tennessee or into northern Georgia, for example, or Alabama. But nevertheless, it's not finished yet. The risk still exists. By the time we get to Monday, the showers are still here. There's more big rain on its way through the Great Lakes, on its way towards Toronto, so expect some stormy stuff Monday night into Tuesday. The showers in the desert southwest aren't as big as they were, but they are still there, and I'm hoping they're welcome, particularly when you get as far west as California. But in Seattle at 26, it looks like the hot weather that's currently with us is cooling down just a little bit, but there are still warnings out for high temperatures in British Columbia. The rain leaving Isles is this little patch here, slowly moving westwards, but it's currently over the water. Otherwise, Mexico is probably the wettest place in Central America. In South America, a largely dry picture with temperatures slowly recovering in Paraguay.
On Counting the Cost, the European Central Bank raises interest rates to rein in inflation. Could rising borrowing costs and political turmoil worsen Italy's debt burden? And the EU agrees to cut natural gas use in winter. Will that help to avert an energy crisis? Counting the cost on Al Jazeera.
Holding the powerful to account as we examine the US's role in the world on Al Jazeera.
Taking children away and trying to change their culture, their minds.
Welcome back. A quick reminder of our top stories here this hour. Supporters of Shia cleric Muqtada Sadr are camping inside Iraq's parliament after storming the building for a second time this week. They're protesting against the nomination of Mohammed Shia al-Sudani as Prime Minister. Iran's president has visited areas hit by flooding and landslides which have killed at least 80 people. Heavy rains have caused havoc in dozens of provinces over the past week. At least 30 people are still missing. And Ukraine's president has ordered the evacuation of the eastern Donetsk region as fighting with Russian forces intensifies. Volodymyr Zelensky also said people in the wider Donbass region, which includes neighboring Luhansk, need to leave. Police have arrested an Italian man on suspicion of murdering a Nigerian vendor. The killing has caused outrage and protests in Italy. Members of the video showed an assailant wrestling Alika Ogochukwu onto his back and beating him. Bystanders in the town on Italy's Adriatic coast called the police but did not intervene. The victim's wife and members of the Nigerian community held a demonstration demanding justice. Well, the growing number of migrants and refugees arriving in Italy has become a political issue ahead of September's snap election. Natasha Ghanem reports on how it's influencing voters on the island of Lampedusa, where there's been a surge in arrivals.
The aquamarine waters of the Mediterranean, surrounded by craggy cliffs, keep luring tourists to these coves. However, vacationers aren't the reason this small Italian island has made headlines in recent years. In 2013, 368 migrants and refugees died when an overcrowded boat capsized near Lampedusa. It was one of the worst shipwrecks in modern European history. Francesco Baratta's father was fishing with a friend when he heard cries for help. He rescued a dozen people and became a national hero.
The people who think all migrants are criminals don't understand what it means to suffer for something and forget that the Westerners have exploited the same Africa they came from.
After people protested, the days when asylum seekers arrived